In the quiet hallway, a tall boy pinned Fumi against the lockers. His face looked more afraid than hers. She clutched her books, eyes down, appearing helpless. He seemed torn between anger and regret, then stepped aside with slumped shoulders. Fumi casually walks away, leaving him standing there, frustrated and alone. At the far end of the corridor, another boy secretly watched this interaction. The hall went still, and no one else seemed to realize what had really happened. Fumi spent most of her time in the back rows of her classes, keeping her voice soft and her expression gentle. She moved through the school hallways with light steps, usually holding her books in a careful way that made her seem fragile or shy. Many people assumed she was simply polite and a little timid. Those who did not know her well had no reason to think there might be anything unusual behind her calm face. A few students, however, noticed that she occasionally spoke in hushed tones to certain boys who had reputations for being lonely or socially awkward. People see her as a nice and kind girl. She, however, never approached them in crowded places. Instead, she waited until she spotted them standing alone during lunch. She would step closer, tilt her head in a friendly manner, and begin a conversation that always started with a minor question. Sometimes she asked if she could borrow a pen. Other times, she pretended to have trouble understanding a specific topic from class. Over time, she mastered the art of making these encounters appear natural and unplanned. Fumi lingered by the vending machine, clutching a half-empty water bottle. Her eyes flicked to Hiroshi, a boy hunched over a math workbook. She let her pencil roll off the desk, its clatter snapping his gaze upward. "Sorry," she whispered, tucking hair behind her ear. She asked, "Could you please?" Then he scrambled to retrieve it, cheeks flushing as their fingers brushed. By week's end, he'd slip her crumpled yen notes for lunch, blind to the identical script she'd rehearsed with 3 other boys. She discovered that many were delighted to receive any attention at all, especially from someone who spoke softly and listened to them. A quiet laugh or a gentle pat on the arm often cemented the feeling that they had found a person who cared. As soon as she felt they saw her as a confidant, she found ways to share mild personal details about herself, though none of them were quite true. She claimed her family situation was difficult, hinting at medical bills or rent problems, but she avoided telling the same story every time. She made small changes to suit each boy's personality, because she had found that some responded best to pity, while others felt driven to act like protectors. It was never a direct request for money. Instead, she let their sympathy fill in the gap. Many boys would volunteer an offer of financial help, desperate to be the ones who rescued her from her imaginary woes. She told them not to mention it to anyone else, because she felt embarrassed, or she worried the teachers would misunderstand. This plea for secrecy excited many of her targets. They believed they shared an exclusive bond, and they tried even harder to keep her trust. She also added small emotional touches, like offering homemade cookies or writing short thank you notes. Sometimes she messed up names, but the victims were too lonely to notice. In most cases, once she extracted a certain amount of money, or felt that her target was growing suspicious, she either staged a short, sad farewell, or quietly faded out of his life. If he questioned her, she showed tears, or wrote him a note saying she could not handle relationships at the moment due to family burdens. If he persisted, she hinted that he was making her uncomfortable and that she needed space. Almost every time, the boy in question either blamed himself for upsetting her. She practiced the same sequence of smiles, soft sobs, and gentle words, day in and day out. A few lonely boys might have suspected her intentions, or felt uneasy about how she disappeared after taking their money, but they lacked proof or the courage to speak out. The school was large enough that rumors drifted and faded quickly, and many students were too preoccupied with tests or to pay attention. One day, while waiting outside a classroom for the next lesson to begin, she noticed a boy standing alone, looking down at the schedule pinned to the corridor's notice board. She had seen him around but never paid much attention. His name was Levi, and he had enrolled in the same grade not long ago, though it was unclear whether he had transferred from another school or simply kept so quiet that no one knew him well. He was of average height and average build, never wore flashy clothes, never joined sports activities, and never seemed to have a close group of friends. He sat in class with a calm posture, never drawing notice to himself, never volunteering to answer questions. He turned in assignments that were neither poor nor excellent. Teachers sometimes forgot he was in the classroom until they saw his name on the roster. Fumi saw a few things that piqued her interest. He usually left school immediately at the last bell, carrying a simple bag that did not appear to hold any special equipment or club materials. Sometimes, he paused near the library, scanning a notice board about upcoming academic events. A few classmates made passing remarks that he might have a part-time job somewhere, since he seemed unconcerned about typical after-school gatherings. She also heard that he never ate lunch with the same person more than once, usually drifting alone to a corner of the canteen. In these habits, she sensed the potential isolation that often made for easy manipulation. She decided that she would not attempt an instant approach. Instead, she noted where he often stood between classes. She observed that he was never approached by other students unless a group assignment forced them to speak. She concluded that he might be a textbook case of emotional distance and possible loneliness. She felt confident that she could draw him out with the right lines. She reasoned that a person who showed little outward excitement might treasure any show of kindness from her even more. She let a few days pass, content to keep an eye on him without making obvious moves. During this period, she continued her usual patterns with 3 other boys. One of them gave her daily lunch money, thinking she is too poor to afford. The other bought her small gifts, such as phone accessories or stationery, whenever she hinted at needing them. She made sure to keep each one believing he was special, telling him that she felt comfortable talking to him because he was different from the rest. Her entire approach relied on secrecy, so she kept them well apart. She also noticed that Levi seemed to watch her sometimes. She suspected he was already in love with her, which would make things easier. She found herself curious about his background, but she had little to go on. She asked a couple of classmates if they knew anything about him, but none gave her detailed answers. They just said he was quiet, got average grades, and never caused problems. Some joked that he was practically invisible. This made her all the more convinced that if she invested patience, she could turn him into the kind of companion who would do anything for her approval. Eventually, she allowed herself to strike up a simple conversation with him. It happened in the hallway after the end of day cleaning, when most students were packing up. She deliberately lingered near his desk, pretending to look for something in her bag. He was slow to notice her, so she softly cleared her throat and asked if he had a spare pen she could borrow. He nodded, handed her a pen from a pouch, and resumed organizing his books without appearing either annoyed or eager. She thanked him, made a vague remark about how chaotic the day had been, and waited for him to comment. He answered with a short, polite remark that carried no emotion. Sensing that further chatter might be unwelcome, she returned the pen, smiled, and left. She was slightly puzzled by his muted reaction, because it lacked the shy awkwardness she often encountered. Still, she felt no discouragement. She assumed he was simply reserved. She thought that if she showed him consistent friendliness, he would open up in time. Over the next few days, she found little excuses to pass by his seat and give him fleeting smiles or nods, checking if he showed any sign of curiosity. He maintained the same bland expression, responding only when necessary. She repeated this approach enough that some classmates wondered if she was tutoring him or if they were starting a low-key friendship. A few days later, she learned from certain students that Levi might have a part-time job at a local store. Others tell her he came from a rich family that gave him tons of pocket money. Either way, it suggested that he had quite good financial support, which fit the narrative she liked. She concluded that, if nothing else, he might have enough savings to give a bit of financial assistance if she played her cards right. It became a routine for her to find him after classes and walk alongside him for a short distance before they parted ways. He did not invite her to do so, but he also did not reject her presence. She sometimes thought she saw a flicker of interest in his eyes when she brought up personal stories, though she could not be certain. She decided that she would soon ramp up her pleas for sympathy, hoping that in a private moment, he would offer something tangible. One afternoon, she slipped him a small note explaining that she felt down and needed someone to talk to. She arranged a more private setting. She found an unlocked classroom after school, typically used by a club that was currently on break. She stood by a row of desks, waiting, heart thumping, script ready. The moment Levi entered, she whispered a greeting that sounded more breathy than she intended. "I'm so sorry to drag you into this," she said, voice trembling just enough to hint at repressed tears. She explained a half-invented story about her family's recent hardships, how her parents were struggling to keep up with certain bills, and how she worried she might have to quit a few school activities. She expected him to respond with at least a question or a comforting remark. Instead, he appeared calm, offered a simple, mild acknowledgement, and waited as if to hear more. She felt a slight tinge of unease at his lack of immediate concern, but she pressed on, describing the weight she felt on her shoulders. She described how she was on the verge of a crisis, claiming her family might have to relocate unless they came up with a certain sum of money. She did not specify the exact amount, but she spoke in trembling tones about how alone she felt. She ended her speech with a long pause, giving him every chance to offer her some form of financial rescue. He stood there, looking neither alarmed nor confused, just calmly present. She felt the sting of uncertainty once more, unsure why he held back. But then, near the end of her speech, she noticed a faint shift in his expression. She interpreted it as empathy. She felt sure that soon, maybe not that exact moment, he would make an offer. She let the meeting end with her thanking him for listening, saying she felt better just having him there to confide in. He walked out, leaving her to wonder if he was close to caving in. She grew determined, feeling that perhaps one final emotional push would seal the deal. She sent him more notes in the following days, each brimming with a slightly more dramatic edge, though never crossing into blatant desperation. She wrote how she neither has a boyfriend nor any good friends to rely on. She praised Levi for being calm and kind, telling him she was grateful for his presence. She was certain that soon he would feel compelled to open his wallet rather than see her suffer further. Then, unexpectedly, two of her older targets exchanged curious glances in the hallway one afternoon. One noticed that the other carried a small gift bag that looked similar to one Fumi had once asked him to provide. They started chatting. Although they did not compare all details, they realized they both had given her money. They parted ways with a sense of uncertainty, each suspecting that maybe she was not as honest as she claimed. Word began spreading in hushed corners that Fumi might be tricking multiple boys. However, most remained too unsure to confront her, and some felt it was not their place to dig into private matters. They were embarrassed at the possibility they had been fooled. She sensed this gradual shift in the atmosphere, noticing that fewer boys approached her with friendly smiles. Even a couple of her victims seemed to be growing more reserved or suspicious. This frightened her. She realized that if multiple people banded together, she might be publicly exposed. She had lived so far under the assumption that each boy would keep quiet out of embarrassment, but she had never considered the risk of them talking to each other. She frantically tried to soothe their doubts, writing small apologies or thanking them for understanding her. She managed to temporarily patch things up, but she saw how precarious her position had become. She turned her hopes more strongly toward Levi, convinced that if she could secure a large sum from him, or at least get him to back her if rumors started to spread, she might still escape any serious fallout. She believed that if he truly had feelings for her, he would defend her against suspicions. She started crafting a final plan to reveal the most dramatic version of her so-called family troubles, aiming to stir his heart so deeply that he would finally step in and rescue her from the situation. She chose a day when classes ended early, figuring they could meet in a deserted classroom or corridor without drawing attention. She left him a note that her situation had become urgent and that she was scared of what might happen if she did not find help soon. She waited in that classroom, imagining how the conversation would go. She stood by the windows, letting the mid-afternoon light wash over the desks, and rehearsed her trembling voice. After some minutes, she heard the door open and turned to see Levi enter. She felt a surge of relief that he had come alone, with no sign of suspicion on his face. She launched into a carefully woven tale that she had refined in her mind for days. She spoke of medical bills, her deteriorating health, and her parents' wants to kick her out. She said she had nowhere else to turn, and that she felt a sense of helpless panic. She described how she might be forced to leave school altogether, unless a miracle occurred. She stood there, eyes flickering with feigned tears, waiting for him to respond with compassion or an offer of assistance. He remained utterly calm. She wondered if perhaps he was deciding what to say, but then she noticed a subtle change in his posture. He took a step closer, set down something on a desk, a small folder of papers or notes, and fixed his eyes on her with a detached expression. She felt an uneasy tingle in the back of her mind, not understanding what he intended. The folder thudded on the desk, Polaroids spilled out, Fumi accepting a necklace from Kenji, fake tears glinting. Beneath them, chat logs highlighted her pleas. Mom's surgery, please don't tell. Levi tapped a time-stamped receipt. 5,000 yen withdrawn the day she couldn't afford textbooks. Then he tapped a Polaroid of Fumi accepting Kenji's necklace. Levi fanned the Polaroids across the desk, each time stamped Tuesday, glaring red. Always Tuesdays, the day after Kenji's allowances. The Polaroids weren't just evidence, they were a timeline. Mondays with Hiroshi, Wednesdays with Ren, all laid bare. Levi hadn't merely caught her, he'd curated her downfall. She looked up at him, but he showed no anger. She attempted to speak, yet her mind failed to produce any coherent excuse. She tried to guess if he had found these things by accident, but the organization of the folder suggested something far more deliberate. She stammered a few fragmented thoughts in her head. She wondered if maybe he wanted to blackmail her, or if he planned to show all this to teachers. She felt a wave of nausea at the idea that her entire strategy was about to collapse. She took a small step back, thinking perhaps she could run out of the room and find some teacher to spin a story about him threatening her. But he moved calmly to block her path, his stance relaxed, revealing no aggression yet leaving no doubt that she would not pass him easily. She paused, feeling her heart race, because she sensed that he was stronger than he looked. It dawned on her that the quiet boy she had believed to be naive or lonely had in fact studied her with far more depth than she had realized. She tried to speak, but only shallow breaths emerged. He remained silent, simply letting her see that the folder contained more evidence than she could have imagined. She realized there was a record of her conversation with the boy who worked part-time, details of when money was given, references to her inconsistent sob stories. She understood that every angle she might have used to defend herself was already closed off. She wondered if he had done it out of a sense of justice, or if he simply wanted to prove a point. She had no way of knowing what lay beneath his silence. She did not see any anger in his eyes, no hatred or scorn. The absence of visible emotion made it more terrifying for her. She could not guess how far he would take this. She felt powerless. Her final instinct for survival rose up, compelling her to try one last strategy. She thought about dropping to her knees, or shedding real tears, or offering to do whatever he asked if he would just keep the folder hidden. She felt shame coil around her gut at the idea of begging so openly, but her fear of total ruin overcame that pride. She tried to speak, forcing out some form of apology or plea, but only a shaky exhale came forth. He gave no indication of being swayed by pity. Finally, he closed the folder in a swift motion, tucked it under his arm, and turned away from her. She felt an overwhelming urge to chase after him, but her legs refused to move. She realized he was leaving without uttering a word. She did not know if that meant he would expose her immediately, or if he was letting her squirm until he decided how to proceed. The door clicked shut behind him, and she was left alone. She sank into the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands, numb with dread and a raging sense of humiliation. She replayed the exchange in her mind, recalling how he had calmly revealed that he possessed far more incriminating information than she ever guessed. In that moment, she felt the tightness of fear knot in her chest. He had walked out with an air of unruffled confidence, leaving her to realize she had lost every ounce of leverage she once believed was hers. She steadied her breathing and forced her legs to carry her into the corridor. The usual hum of after-school chatter was gone. Only the echo of her footsteps accompanied her as she made her way toward a quiet section of the campus, determined to corner Levi once more. She refused to let him dominate the situation so effortlessly. She had one last plan: to threaten him with a devastating false accusation that would paint him as a harasser if he dared to expose her scams. She found him by the gym's side exit, leaning against a wall, backpack slung over one shoulder. The fading afternoon light cast a slanting glow across the pavement. Summoning her courage, she confronted him. Who'd believe a transfer student with no friends? Her laugh trembled. "I'll tell them you cornered me here, that you've always watched me. Too close." She leaned in, breath hitching with practiced tears. "They'll see a predator, Levi, not a savior." She intended to spread rumors of harassment, an accusation so alarming that even the most thorough logs and screenshots might pale beside her tearful story. Her heart pounded as she delivered this threat, trying to mask how desperate she truly felt. Rain drummed the gym's tin roof as Levi pressed the play button. Fumi's voice slithered from the phone. "I'll say you assaulted me. Who'll believe you?" The recording hissed with the shuffle of her shoes, proof he'd stood inches away. The unspoken threat hung louder than her words. Each syllable of her newly hatched plan, every vow to accuse him of something vile if he revealed her scams, was captured in stark detail. The recording made it clear that her story was premeditated and false, meant purely to silence him. She felt her blood turn to ice as she realized how fully he had anticipated her final weapon. When the audio ended, he slid the phone back, not displaying anger or triumph, but a faint sense of distant amusement. She stood there, speechless, any final hope of regaining control, crushed by the knowledge that if he shared that recording, she would be ruined in ways far beyond mere exposure of her money-grubbing cons. Once again, she found herself facing his silent mastery of the situation, but this time, he did not threaten to destroy her. Instead, in a measured tone, he made it clear he had no intention of handing over the evidence, neither her scams nor her twisted threat, to the principal. Rather, he admitted an odd fascination with her cunning and her ability to deceive others so thoroughly. He was not interested in punishing her or watching her beg for mercy. He had observed how skillfully she had manipulated lonely students, and he saw potential in that craftiness for his own ends. Her confusion deepened when she realized he wanted something from her. Not money and not some confession of guilt, but a favor. His words landed with a surreal weight. He found her useful. After all, she knew who was vulnerable around campus, which classmates carried secret grudges or hidden talents, and which teachers could be swayed by carefully planted rumors. The very qualities that once made her a quiet predator in the shadows might serve him if she followed his instructions. She felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. Her final gambit, the false harassment threat, had not only failed but given him a new piece of leverage, the recording of her malicious intentions. Yet instead of wielding it to expel or publicly shame her, he was calmly enlisting her as a reluctant partner, forced to comply lest he decide to release everything he had compiled. She stammered an attempt at refusal, but quickly realized there was no real choice. His evidence, both old and new, gave him absolute power over her reputation. She dropped her gaze to the ground, mumbling a vague assent to avoid provoking him further. It struck her as painfully ironic that the same lies and manipulations she once orchestrated so smoothly now bound her to a silent arrangement with someone far more calculating than she had ever imagined. Levi did not gloat. He merely turned to go, leaving Fumi standing in that empty side lot. She watched him vanish around a corner, each step echoing against the concrete. Her hands trembled at her sides, her teeth clenched in frustration and dread. Everything about him radiated a measured confidence that told her he expected her cooperation without question. Only after he disappeared completely did she allow herself to slump against the wall, grappling with the full meaning of his words. She tried to quell the panic rising in her chest, fully aware that she now owed him. Fumi initially believed she was entirely alone in the quiet corridor after Levi's abrupt departure. The school was nearly deserted at this late hour. She stood by a row of lockers, trying to settle her nerves before heading home. That was when he appeared, a tall, muscular boy from her past, someone Fumi had once manipulated under a veil of gentle flattery and false need. She had ghosted him the moment he was no longer profitable, confident he would be too ashamed or broken-hearted to ever seek her out. Now, here he was, eyes heavy with bitterness and betrayal as he closed the distance between them. His accusations emerged in a bitter rush, laced with the hurt of someone who discovered he'd been used. Fumi barely managed a shaky inhale before his hand closed around her forearm. Adrenaline spiked, dread clamping her chest. She glanced around the deserted hallway, but there was no one left to help. Before the taller youth could retaliate, Levi, in a matter of seconds, moved like scissors through silk. A palm strike to the diaphragm, a knee hooked behind tendons. Muscular body crumpled, wheezing. Levi crouched, his voice cold as a winter breeze. "Your father's missing 200,000 yen. Care to explain?" The boy's eyes widened. Without waiting for an answer, Levi rose, dusted his sleeves and said, "Go." After that, Levi simply stepped back, as though disposing of a fleeting inconvenience. The boy staggered, breath labored, clearly recognizing he was outmatched. He glared at Fumi, anguish and anger mingling, but retreated without another word. His heavy footsteps soon vanished in the empty hall. Fumi stayed behind, heart thundering in her ears. She touched the place on her arm where the boy had grabbed her. It stung, but not half as much as the swirl of conflicted emotions lingering in her mind. Despite their twisted arrangement, despite her hatred of how Levi blackmailed her, Fumi felt an unbidden warmth at the memory of Levi's effortless protection. But when she slept that night, she didn't dream of faceless boys, only Levi's calm voice saying useful, and the shameful warmth it sparked. If a single word from him could quell threats, might she be safest at his side? The logic was tangled, but the relief was real. Meanwhile, Fumi remained oblivious that Levi had staged the entire confrontation, timing his own intervention to heighten her fear and gratitude. He had been pulling the strings from the start, long before she even decided to target him. From leaking rumors that he might be wealthy to carefully placing himself where she'd accidentally notice him, Levi engineered each encounter so she would think she was in control. By rescuing her at the perfect moment, he aimed to deepen her dependence and secure her obedience, making her work diligently as an indispensable pawn for his motives.